Hello, welcome our Bible Tales.
There's something quietly shifting in the world, something subtle but incredibly powerful. You're not going to see it leading the nightly news or trending as a hashtag, but it's a revolution nonetheless. For literally thousands of years, belief in gods was simply assumed. It was the default setting for humanity, the background hum of every culture, from the smallest tribe to the largest empire. It wasn't a choice, it was just the air people breathed. But now, more and more people are stepping away from it. They're not doing it in protest or out of some loud, angry rebellion. They're just walking away, quietly, peacefully, and without looking back. The big question, of course, is why. Why is atheism, or at the very least a general non-belief, growing so steadily around the world? And this isn't just a phenomenon in Western countries, which is the common stereotype. It's happening globally, even in places where religion has been deeply woven into the very fabric of everyday life for centuries. This isn't a movement being driven by charismatic leaders, and it's not something you'll see debated in fiery speeches on the political stage. But the numbers are clear, and they tell a fascinating story. The rise of non-religious identity is one of the most significant and underreported cultural shifts of our time. When you look closer, it starts to make a lot of sense. It's not really about rejecting gods in an aggressive way. It's more like waking up from something. It's about no longer needing the answers that we used to cling to for comfort and security. It's about outgrowing ideas that once felt absolutely necessary for survival, but now, in the modern world, feel a little out of place, like an old piece of furniture that no longer fits in the room. To understand why this is happening, we need to zoom in on something that often gets overlooked: the silent, nagging discomfort that religion can create for people who are really paying attention. The cracks in belief don't usually start with some grand, dramatic epiphany. They begin with questions, little ones, the kind that get under your skin and don't go away. Questions like, why does an all-loving deity demand constant worship and praise? Doesn't that seem a bit needy? Or why are ancient texts from thousands of years ago treated as unquestionable moral authorities when they contain laws and punishments that no modern, compassionate society would ever accept? And the questions keep coming. Why do so many religious systems seem utterly obsessed with control? Control over what you think, control over what you do, and especially control through the powerful emotions of guilt and shame. These aren't new questions, of course. People have been wrestling with them for centuries, but in the past they were much easier to push aside. You might have been raised to ignore them, or you were told that having doubt was a sign of a spiritual failing, a weakness in your character. Your questions were a problem to be solved, not a path to be explored. But now, the space to ask is wider than ever before. The internet, books, podcasts, online forums, they've made it possible to explore these ideas without immediate fear of judgment or ostracization from your community. And when people finally start looking for honest answers, what they find is often surprising. They find out that morality doesn't collapse without religion holding it up. They discover that life doesn't suddenly feel empty and meaningless when you let go of sacred beliefs. In fact, many find the opposite. They realize that meaning isn't something handed down from above. It's something we build ourselves, day by day, through our actions, our relationships, and our own reflections. This is the real core of what's driving the shift. It's not anger, and it's not cynicism. It's clarity. The more people learn about the world, about history, psychology, and science, the more they begin to see how these ancient belief systems were actually formed. They weren't handed down from the heavens in a flash of divine insight. They were built, piece by piece, out of very human materials: politics, power struggles, fear, tradition, and most of all, a profound and terrifying uncertainty about the universe. For most of our history, religion wasn't just about finding some abstract truth. It was a practical tool for survival. It was a mechanism for social control, for keeping tribes and societies cohesive. And crucially, it was a way to fill in the massive, frightening gaps in our knowledge. But over the last few centuries, and especially in the last few decades, those gaps have started to close. As science, philosophy, and psychology have moved forward, the role that religion used to play becomes harder and harder to justify. This isn't about science versus spirituality, in some kind of epic battle. It is a much quieter and more personal process of simply asking whether certain ideas still make sense in light of what we now know. Let's be real and take a concept like hell, for example, an eternal place of infinite torment, supposedly created by an all-loving God, to punish finite beings for the finite mistakes they made during their brief time on earth. When that idea is no longer protected by a thick wall of fear, when you can just look at it plainly, it stops feeling like divine justice and starts to look a lot more like psychological abuse. And yet, billions of people are taught to believe in it from early childhood, long before they're old enough to critically analyze what they're actually agreeing to. That isn't a free path to truth. That's conditioning, and more people are starting to recognize it for what it is. It has no coincidence that atheism and non-belief are rising fastest in places where education levels are higher, and where people have access to diverse sources of information. This isn't about intelligence. It's not that religious people are less smart. It's about exposure. It's about what happens when you're finally allowed to think freely, without being told that certain thoughts are dangerous or forbidden. Once people realize they won't be struck down by lightning for questioning the stories they were raised on, they don't stop. They keep going. They start asking deeper questions, not just about gods, but about the entire systems built around those gods' rules, the hierarchies, the rituals, the punishments, on whether any of it actually holds up under scrutiny. This is why the change is happening so quietly. It's not a single, dramatic event. It's a slow unraveling, a gentle fading out. People don't typically wake up one day and suddenly renounce their faith in a fit of passion. It usually starts with a small hesitation, a pause, a whisper of doubt that they can't quite shake. And once that little crack forms in the foundation, it doesn't just seal itself back up, it grows. And then, something even more surprising often happens. People feel relief. Not fear, not emptiness, not the moral chaos they were warned about. They feel freedom, because so much of what religion does, functionally, is bind people to roles they didn't choose, to a sense of guilt they didn't earn, and to fears they never had a chance to question. Without that constant pressure, there's suddenly space to breathe again, to see the world and even yourself more clearly. That doesn't mean all the answers magically become obvious. It just means the old answers stop pretending to be sacred and untouchable. They become what they always were: guesses, stories, and very human inventions. And once you see them that way, it's incredibly hard to go back. A lot of this shift starts early, in childhood, but not always in the way people expect. In the past, religion was so deeply embedded into family life, school systems, and cultural identity that questioning it felt like questioning your own roots, your very being. In many places around the world, it still does. But that tight grip is loosening. Kids today are growing up with more access to outside perspectives than any generation in human history. They don't have to rely solely on their parents or their local clergy for answers anymore. They have entire worlds of information right at their fingertips. They can hear directly from former believers who share their deconstruction stories. They can listen to scientists, philosophers, and just regular people who have stepped away from faith and have gone on to build rich, meaningful lives without it. The more they hear those stories, the more normalized it becomes to question their own beliefs. It's not that doubt is new. Doubt has always existed. The difference is that doubt used to be an isolating experience. You felt like you were the only one in your family, your town, or your church who was thinking these things. You were alone. But now, doubt is connected. You don't feel alone when you wonder if the stories you were told are really true, because you can go online and instantly find thousands, even millions of other people who are wondering the exact same thing and are openly talking about it. That sense of community is incredibly powerful. It's what's fueling this quiet rise of disbelief, not an organized war against religion, but a slow, steady erosion of the fear that once protected it from scrutiny. And once that fear is gone, the questions just keep coming, faster and with more confidence than ever before. And once that fear is gone, the questions come faster and harder. Why does religion, in so many of its forms, seem so obsessed with obedience? Why is simply asking a question often seen as a threat, an act of defiance rather than genuine inquiry? Why are so many religious communities structured around a rigid pyramid of authority, rather than a collaborative search for truth? The answers aren't always comfortable, because for many religious systems, obedience isn't just a desirable value. It's the absolute foundation of the entire structure. When you start building your identity around personal agency, around the idea that you are the author of your own life, you begin to notice just how much of religion depends on keeping people feeling small. This isn't always a deliberate, malicious act, but it's a functional reality. If you believe you are inherently broken or sinful by nature, you will always need an external source of salvation. If you believe that life without God is inherently meaningless, you'll never dare to look for meaning on your own terms. If you believe that morality comes only from a divine source, you'll always be afraid to trust your own judgment and conscience. For centuries, those beliefs worked. They kept societies in line. They offered a sense of comfort in times of overwhelming fear and uncertainty. They filled in the gaps in our understanding when we simply had no better explanations. But now, we do. Now we have a much deeper understanding of the origins of morality through evolution and the development of empathy. We understand how social rules and cooperation evolved, not because of a divine command, but because of the practical necessities of survival. We even understand death differently. We know it's final, and for many, that doesn't make this life less meaningful. It makes it infinitely more precious and urgent. The old fear was that if you took religion away, society would crumble into despair and chaos. People would run wild, with no moral compass to guide them. But that's just not what's happening. What's happening is that people are discovering how to live more honestly. They're building their values not out of blind obedience to ancient texts, but out of thoughtful reflection, mutual respect, and a deeper, more scientific understanding of what it actually means to be a human being. And they're realizing that you don't need an invisible judge watching over your shoulder to be a good person. In fact, many are coming to a more radical conclusion. When goodness is only motivated by the hope of a reward or the fear of a punishment, it isn't really goodness at all. It's compliance. It's just following the rules to get a cosmic treat or avoid a cosmic spank. True ethics, true morality, requires freedom. It requires the freedom to think for yourself, to feel empathy for others, to question authority, and to act based on your own conscience. And when people are finally free to do that, they start to notice how much better it feels than the constant undercurrent of guilt, shame, or fear ever did. That's another profound reason why belief is fading. It's not out of pride or arrogance, but out of sheer relief, because it is exhausting to live under the weight of constant judgment, even if that judgment is invisible. The rise of secularism, of simply living life without religion, isn't about arrogance or nihilism. It's about lifting a weight that many people didn't even know they were carrying. It's about stepping into the world without needing it to be part of some grand, cosmic plan. It's about learning to accept uncertainty and ambiguity rather than frantically trying to plug every gap in our knowledge with a supernatural explanation. That shift, while quiet, is massive, because it opens the door to a completely different kind of relationship with life itself. This new relationship with life isn't one rooted in doctrine or the promise of salvation. It's rooted in curiosity, in direct experience, and in a deep connection with others and with oneself. Of course, religion isn't going to vanish overnight. It still holds tremendous influence and power in many parts of the world. But its absolute dominance is no longer guaranteed. In places where religion once shaped every law, every school, and every election, people are slowly beginning to separate faith from governance. And, just as importantly, from their personal identity. They're restarting to realize that not believing in a God doesn't make you an empty or broken person. It just means you're working from a different set of tools. And often, those tools, reason, empathy, science, critical thinking, are more flexible, more grounded in reality, and ultimately, more compassionate. Because when you no longer believe in a divine plan that has everything sorted out, you start taking more responsibility for what happens right here, right now. You stop waiting for heaven and you start trying to build something a little better here on earth. You stop fearing divine judgment and start focusing on human understanding. And maybe most importantly, you stop seeing other people through the lens of belief: who's saved, who's damned, who's in my group, who's an outsider. You just start seeing them as human. That shift changes everything. It changes how you love, how you raise your children, how you approach death, and how you forgive yourself for your mistakes. It's not an easy path, it's not always comfortable, but it is real. And more people are waking up to it. Not because they've been persuaded by a clever argument, but because the old explanations simply stopped making sense. The rituals started feeling hollow, and the silence they were told to fill with prayer didn't actually need filling after all. One of the biggest drivers of this global shift is something we almost take for granted now: connection. For most of human history, your world was your village, your family, your local place of worship. There just weren't many opportunities to encounter people who thought differently, and if you did, they were often framed as dangerous outsiders or enemies to be converted. But today, that barrier has all but vanished. We don't live in isolated pockets anymore. We live in a massive, interconnected web of voices, ideas, questions, and stories from every corner of the globe. And when you start hearing just how many people have found peace, purpose, and clarity outside of religion, it starts to feel a lot less risky to reconsider what you've been taught. There's safety in numbers, and suddenly you realize you're not the only one who doesn't believe. You're one of millions. Globalization didn't just change our economies, it changed our beliefs. It forced ancient traditions to sit right next to modern realities, and in that direct comparison, some of those traditions just don't hold up. A teenager in a highly religious country can now scroll through videos from people who left their faith and are absolutely thriving. They can read the science behind belief itself, how our brains are wired to find patterns, seek comfort, and fear the unknown. And suddenly, the sacred starts to feel a lot more psychological than supernatural. But it's not just technology or culture doing the damage. In many cases, religion is undermining itself. Scandals, abuse, corruption, hypocrisy, these aren't rare exceptions anymore. They are patterns that people can't help but notice. When religious institutions preach humility but hoard wealth, preach purity but hide predators, or preach love but foster division, their credibility collapses. People aren't leaving because they suddenly want to sin. They're leaving because they no longer trust the messengers. And when the messenger is revealed to be deeply flawed, the message stops sounding so holy. That era where religious leaders held automatic moral authority is ending. Now, authority has to be earned, and many religious institutions simply aren't adapting fast enough. So, what's replacing that old framework? It's not one single, neat, unified worldview that's stepping in to fill the gap. And that's actually a huge part of the appeal. People are tired of rigid systems. They're tired of being told exactly what to believe, how to live, and what to fear. They want room to explore. They want the space to say, "I don't know," without being punished for it. They want to live with the questions rather than pretending they have all the answers. And that openness, that intellectual humility, is precisely what many people find when they step away from the absolute certainty of religious dogma. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about being honest enough to admit that we don't. And somehow, that honesty feels more sacred than any sermon ever did. So what does this all mean? What actually happens when millions of people across different countries, generations, and backgrounds start letting go of the idea of God? Well, nothing dramatic at first. The sky doesn't fall. People don't suddenly turn evil. Society doesn't collapse into chaos. Instead, something much quieter and more profound happens. People begin to think for themselves. They begin to take ownership of their choices, their values, and their mistakes. They stop outsourcing their morality to an ancient book or a divine being and start building it from within. And that, in many ways, is the most important shift of all. Because when morality isn't tied to the fear of punishment or the hope of a reward, it becomes more genuine. You don't help others because a God told you to. You help them because you see yourself in them, because compassion, empathy, and a sense of fairness are part of what it means to be human, not divine commands. This is what so many people are rediscovering. You do indeed need sacred texts to live a meaningful life. You don't need ancient rules to be kind and courageous, and you certainly do. You don't need to believe in the concept of sin to know when you've caused harm and to want to make things right. These are human capacities we've had all along. The rise of atheism, then, isn't the loss of something sacred. It's the return to something real. It's the recognition that meaning, morality, purpose, and love don't come from above. They come from here, they come from us. They come from the way we treat each other, the way we learn, the way we create, and the way we navigate our profound uncertainty with honesty and care. This isn't a new idea, but it's finally becoming a widespread one, and it's happening at a time when we need it most. Because the world is facing problems that no prayer can solve and no scripture can guide us through. We need clear thinking, real-world compassion, and a sense of shared responsibility. And that means stepping out of the shadow of dogma and into the light of a more conscious, intentional way of living. This shift won't happen all at once. Religion still holds immense power politically, economically, and socially. It still comforts billions, and for some, it will always provide a sense of meaning. But for a growing number of people, it no longer fits. It no longer answers the questions, and it no longer feels like home. And so, people walk away, quietly, thoughtfully, sometimes painfully, but with each person who leaves, the path becomes a little easier for the next. The conversation expands, moving beyond just what we don't believe, and toward a more important question. What kind of world do we want to build in the absence of divine authority? A world where value comes from what we do, not what we worship. Where progress is measured by how much we understand, not how faithfully we obey. Where freedom means more than just religious liberty. It means freedom from religion, too. That's the future of more people are stepping in. And that's why atheism is rising, not in anger, but in awakening. Not as a rejection of meaning, but as a full-throated embrace of reality.
Thank you for watching. Enjoyed the video? Don't forget to like and share if you found it helpful or interesting.